Bishop and pawn versus knight. Got loads and loads of positions to go through. Again, there are no sort of general rules that you can follow, like, oh, in this position with your, if it's a rook's pawn, you do this. If it's a central pawn, you do this. You move your bishop to this square. You put your king here, and then it's a win. There just isn't anything like that. So it's just a collection of games that are all sort of on the critical point of, like, you know, that they look like they're a win, but actually they're a draw, or they're, you know, they could be drawn, but one of the players played badly and let the draw slip, and it was a win, and all those sorts of things. If you're the attacker, so the bishop and pawn side, your main offensive tool is zugzwang. That's the main way these positions get won. If you're defending, there's lots of little tricks that you can have as the defending side. One of them's stalemate if the king's near the edge of the board, and sometimes perpetuals. This one here could end in a perpetual if white plays it badly, for example. Something to watch out for both sides that's true in knight and pawn versus bishop, or bishop and pawn versus knight, is the idea of just sort of the conventional thinking of which squares are covered by our king and bishop, or which squares are covered by our king and knight. You kind of need to sort of shock your thinking into forgetting all that, because if you're the attacking side, you've got to promote the pawn. So, I mean, for example, well, here the bishop's defending the e-pawn at the moment, but if the bishop moved off the defense of the e-pawn, I'm not sure why it's particularly relevant here, but for example, the white king is not defending c8. So, you know, if the knight was on c8, we couldn't take it because the e-pawn falls. The e-pawn falling is more important. So be on the lookout for that all the time there are squares that aren't actually being covered. Your minor piece is being deflected from stopping the promotion. So it's completely irrelevant here because we've got a dark squared bishop, but the black knight is not guarding any of these squares because it has to stay on g7 to guard e8. So that's something that's, I think I picked the worst position to talk about this, but that's something that's always worth being on the lookout for. But there are no set rules, so let's just go through loads of different positions and show the side with the knight doing some really sneaky defensive stuff, and the side with the bishop being really clever and using zugzwang and triangulating in an ingenious way. So this position, pause the video if you like, it's white to play. How would you go about winning it? There are 4 moves that win, but 3 of them, they don't really win the position so much as not chuck the win away. So any bishop move on this diagonal, where we're still covering the f8 square, and white's still got a winning position. Any bishop move off that diagonal, we've messed it up. And any king move that relinquishes control of e8, clearly we've messed it up. Which doesn't leave many options. The winning move is king d7. The thing to be careful of is if you just sort of get sloppy and attack the knight, thinking, well, you know, the black knight has to move to e8, and then we'll come to e5, we're dominating the knight and we've won. And that's true. If the black knight goes to e8, white has just won very, very quickly. But the black knight doesn't go to e8. The black knight goes to e6, d7, f8 check. Again, the sort of the conventional thing, you wouldn't think to put your knight on that square in a middle game or an opening because it's just covered by the pawn. I mean, often in chess, of course, we get tactics all the time where for some reason that pawn's not attacking f8 because it opens up a file and rook takes a queen or whatever. But in these knight and pawn, or bishop and pawn versus knight, or knight and pawn versus bishop positions, this just happens sort of all the time, so it's something to be on the lookout for. So the white pawn isn't really stopping knight f8 check, because that's all black has to do is win that pawn. And this is just completely drawn now. If the white king steps to d6, I mean, black's got lots of drawing moves here, but the easiest one is just to attack the pawn straight away. And you will take that pawn on the next go, whether it's a freebie on e8 or having to sack your knight on e7. So the white king can't go to d6, and it goes to d8, and we've got a perpetual. Oops. So what white should have done was king d7. Knight to e8, and the bishop just comes back to d4, just guarding the f6 square, because we basically don't want the black king to move. If the black king moves, obviously we're gonna take the knight. If the knight moves to one of these three squares, we just take it. I paused a little bit on d6 there. It's like, it's okay, we would just take it. But for example, the thing I was talking about earlier, that the white king is not defending the c7 square. I mean, it's not a problem for white. We've just got a quick little zugzwang to get out of it. We keep our bishop on the protection of f6. If the black king moves, we take the knight, because the black king can't take our pawn on e7. If the knight moves anywhere other than e8, we queen, so the knight has to come to e8 and then bishop e5. That's your zugzwang. It's done. So yeah, that was quite a good position, because it sort of demonstrated how the zugzwang is sort of typical, and also how if the attacking side with the bishop is just a little bit sloppy, that the side with the knight has defensive resources. And those defensive resources is not just a case of sometimes white has to be careful, otherwise it's a draw. Sometimes it's just a draw. This is a game from 2003. There is nothing to show in this particular position. It ended with bishop f5, king h8, and they just agreed a draw, because we've got the stalemate theme. All black needs to do is have a rule that if the white bishop is defending h7, we play our king to h8, regardless of what's going on. We don't care. The knight's on f8, the bishop's guarding h7, so I just don't care what white does on the next move. I'm either going to put my king back on g7, or I'm going to be stalemated after losing my knight. The only way that could be a problem is if the white king now played king f6, and then we can't operate that particular rule. Sorry, the second bit of the rule is if the bishop's not defending h7, we would just put our knight on h7 and then put it back. Okay, with our king being on g7, that is. So if the bishop's not guarding h7, then we just put our knight on h7 and then put it back on f8. If the bishop is guarding h7, we put our king to h8. So what if the white king then arrives on f6? Well, then you've got this sneaky little move, knight g6. So in this particular game, whoever was playing white didn't wait to find that out. They didn't move. I'm sure they could have arranged it to get black in a bit of a zugzwang, do a triangulation with the king, dump it on f6 in this position, but then black's just going to play knight g6. And that's assuming, by the way, that white can actually set that up. Next, this is a game from 2003. It's white to play. What would you do? Pause the video and have a go at finding white's next move. In the game, knight c4 was played. Black played king d4, and white resigned. I mean, it's clearly a resignable position, this. The king can't move because you lose the knight, and the knight can't move because the d2 pawn push is happening. So, I mean, white's obviously completely stuffed, completely and utterly stuffed. The only thing that puzzles me is why didn't white see that here? Top players, you would think every time they play a move, well, if I play that, my opponent will play that, and then they'll have at least have a semi-plan of what they're going to do next. So in this position, I'm thinking, right, knight c4. What will black do next? King d4 is such an obvious move. What do I do then? Oh, I resign. So, what? So you would look around for something different, wouldn't you? You would look around for, even knight g4, hoping to get to the d1 square via f2. It doesn't look very good. It looks like king f3. shoulders the knight away straight away because this check's not possible because the bishop picks up the knight. But you'd look for something. And surely you would then arrive at like, well, knight f1, I'll give it a try. You know, it can just stay there. The bishop can't touch it. If the pawn moves, I'll take the pawn. And if the king comes to collect it, I suppose I've always got the counter-attack on black's pawn. And then you'd look at it and think, well, actually, that's pretty good, isn't it? How does black thwart that plan? And he doesn't. This is a draw. So if king f3, king c4 immediately forks the bishop and the pawn. If the bishop wasn't attacked there, by the way, we have got a sort of zugzwang problem that we'd need to think about. So if the bishop was on f6 or e5, or in fact anywhere on this diagonal, I think I'm right in saying. Oh no, sorry, it'd have to be on e5. If the bishop was on e5, then king e2 wins the game for black. The reason for e5 being important is you've got to control these two squares, so the kings run out of ways to attack the c-pawn. And you look around for knight moves. This knight check here is very useful, but that's why the bishop has to be on e5. So there's some positions coming up later on where this sort of thing's going on, and that's the zugzwang that black's trying to achieve. Here it's all irrelevant because king f3, king c4 hits the bishop and the pawn straight away. So we might instead see king d4, white just waits around. White just waits in the wings. Or king d5, king c4, white just waits around. Then into c4, we've got this knight e3 check, and then back to f1. It's just a draw. Thankfully for black, white played knight c4, black played king d4, and that was it. It was over. Right, next, this is a study from 1955, and this is winning position for white, and this one demonstrates the zugzwang thing very nicely. Okay, so the thing I was talking about earlier on, we've got a black knight that is actually really well placed on f6. Okay, possibilities of coming to f8 and being even better placed, kind of similar to the previous position, but it's very well placed here. And as long as the black, if black's got a rule, they'll just maintain contact with the d6 pawn, just keep moving their king, and eventually, if the pawn moves, the knight just takes it, and it's difficult to see how white breaks this plan down. White can break that plan down in this particular position, and zugzwang is the tool to break it down. So bishop b3 check is the first move. King e5 loses immediately to bishop e6. That's your zugzwang straight away. In fact, that's pretty much the same position as we just looked at a second ago. So we see king c5. Black just maintains contact with the d6 pawn. Now, if white gets a bit sloppy here, just for example, king e6, then that allows this knight h7 idea. King back to e7, knight f8. And yeah, and this is actually led straight away to, well, this is actually now a 1938 study. So even though the original position that we looked at there was a 1955 study, it incorporated as part of it, if white plays the blundering king e6 in this position, black can transpose to this 1938 study, which is a draw. Okay, and the reason it's a draw is white can't set up the zugzwang. The zugzwang position here is where the white bishop's on e4, and it's black to move, because black wants to use these three squares to maintain contact with the d pawn and not have to move their knight. If the bishop's covering those two squares and the black king is on c5, then knight g6 check, and that's going to be a perpetual, basically, because the white king would have to maintain contact with the d pawn, and you're just going to. I'm pretty sure that's just a perpetual. So that's why the e4 square is the Zugzwang square. But it can't be achieved. It cannot be achieved, and so this is just a draw. If we get to this position, whatever white tries, I don't know. We have to control g6, so bishop c2 might be a winning try. All you have to do as black is make sure that you don't play king c5. Okay, that's pretty easy here. So let's go king c6. White. If I was playing white, I would just play a waiting move. No, bishop d3. You've got to maintain contact with g6. You've got to stop those knight g6 checks. And king c5 would lose the game now to bishop e4. But you just play king d5. If white waits, you play king c6. You just keep going back and forth on these two squares until you get checked, and then you come to c5. And it's the position white wants, but white needs this position with black to move. Later on, I'll show a position where if there was an I file, then white could win it. You're thinking, what? How? How does white win that just by there being an I file? If we're on the h5 square, we are controlling the g6 square, and we're ready to check on this diagonal. Sadly, for white in this position, there is no other square on that diagonal where we're covering g6 and we're ready to come back and check on this diagonal. If there was an I4 square, we could use h5 and I4 to stop black's little triangulation plan. Clear as mud. I'll show a position later on that does that. Anyway, bishop b3 check. This is a win for white, this position, remember. King c5, and now if king e6, blunder, we transpose from a 1955 study into a 1938 study that is a draw by what I just talked about, that white can't achieve that Zugzwang, but wouldn't be a draw if there was an I4 square. So fascinating. Let's look at that later on. But white's not going to play king e6 because that's a draw. Instead, white plays a waiting move, bishop a2. Black just triangulates, king c6. Okay, just staying on the. Well, they have to stay in contact with the d pawns, but they can't come to d5 because it's covered. And now we can play king e6. Okay, because this time, when the knight comes to h7, bishop d5 arrives with check. King back to c5. King e7. Absolutely brilliant move. Again, that bishop can't be taken. We always have to shock our standard way of thinking of like the bishop doesn't matter. Promoting the pawn does. So king e7. We couldn't push the d pawn because knight f8 check was happening. But after knight f6, well, after knight f8, we've got the Zugzwang we want. That's that Zugzwang position I talked about. And after knight f6, bishop back to f3. And black's in Zugzwang again. It's another Zugzwang. We might see knight g8 check. I mean, the knight's got to move. The king can't move because we'll just take the knight. So the knight's got to move. Knight g8 check might seem reasonable. King e6, knight f6, and even this last move. I mean, white's played so many clever moves so far. What would you do here? What's the final? What's the final little finesse to this? I mean, white's got lots of different moves, but check this one out. Bishop e4. How about that? Absolutely beautiful. Because yeah, black can't even play knight h7 anymore to stop with the knight f8 fork idea. So I'm reasonably sure we can sort of almost pre-move d7 here. Yeah. Just looking down the engine's list of moves, I mean, we can't play d7 against that, but we just take the knight, and we can't play d7 against that, but we just take the knight. Next position is that 1938 study that I've just covered. That was a part of that previous one. So it's weird. We're sort of going backwards in time. This is a study from 1856, which is now the same problem, but it's shifted one file to the left. So now the I4 square exists, and the I4 square existing, which is now called H4, is the key to white winning this. White's able to achieve the Zugzwang. Took me a while to get it. I didn't go exactly the same route as in the Dvoretsky book, but I did get this one. And yeah, so what we do, we've got to guard the f6 square. Okay, knight coming to f6 is a pain. Black's going to try use those three squares. They just as long as Black's king stays in contact with the c6 pawn, the white king can't move without giving up the c6 pawn. So we've got to try and, well, we want our bishop on d4, basically. If we can get our bishop on d4 with the black king on c5, we've done it. Because we're covering those two squares and we're covering the annoying knight f6 check. But it's actually very hard to achieve. In fact, if there was no h-file, we've just seen that it can't be achieved. So this is basically the same problem, and that Zugzwang cannot be achieved. So back to this position. How is it achieved? How is the existence of this extra square important? Well, the idea is we always have to cover the f6 square. We're going to basically maneuver our bishop to this diagonal here, so that it's always covering the f6 square. Black's going to be following a rule, which is they're always going to put their king on one of these two squares, so that or one of these three squares, sorry. And if the white bishop is ready to come to d4, then they'll need their king on one of these two squares. Okay, which is happening at the moment, by the way. Like if white plays bishop d4 straight away, then black can play king b5 or king d5. It doesn't matter. Okay. These two squares are kind of almost the same, but you're better off going to b5 as black, because then you've got more options on the next move. So yeah, this just wouldn't work at all for white. This here, because we've got the position we want, but we need this position with black to move. So yeah, a better first move, bishop c3, and black does not want to go to b5. Black goes to b5, bishop d4. You've got the Zugzwang straight away. Okay, so don't do that basically. So the black king would go to, and d5 by the way, same thing. You get the Zugzwang straight away. Okay, so black has to play king b6, because now if bishop d4 check, you just bring the king to b5, and we're back in that muddle again. So king b6, and white can sort of just mess around a bit. White does bring their bishop back to b2, and again black doesn't want to put their king on b5 because you play bishop d4. So black would play king c5, and you're like, this is very annoying. As long as white's bishop stands ready to go to d4, black does not put their king on b5. And then as soon as white does something else and isn't ready to come to d4, black can put their king on b5. And in fact, black has to put their king on b5, as we'll see now. So this was the winning plan I came up with. Bishop a3 check. And now king to b5. Bishop to e7. That's important. We've got to stop this annoying knight f6 check. And I suppose black can't put their king on b5. But it's okay because white's not ready to put their bishop onto d4 at the moment. So and king c5 is not possible. So king b6 absolutely fine. Then bishop to g5. Again, keeping an eye on this f6 square. We don't keep an eye on that f6 square. Knight f6 check is going to be a horrible perpetual. We can't do anything about that. And black doesn't want to put their king on c5 here, because if king c5, bishop e3 check, we're covering both those squares. The black king has to go to b5 or d5, and you get the bishop d4 Zugzwang that you're looking for. So black's not going to play along with that. Black's going to play king b5. You're like, what do I do next? Well, this is why the h4 square is now needed, because we've got to stay on this diagonal to stop the annoying knight f6 check. but we've got to pick a square on that diagonal where we can come back and check on this diagonal. So when there was no h4 square, that wasn't possible. But here there is an h4 square. Black stuffed. They have to step to either c5 or b6. Bishop f2, king b5, king d5. It doesn't matter. Bishop d4. There's your Zugzwang. So that was all decided back in 1856, that study. And then in 1938, we had this study that was on the same lines, but is a draw because there's no I4 square. So that's, what is that? That's 88 years or something. It's a long time. It's a long time. 82 years, I think. 82 years later. I do wonder whether the guy that came up with this study was aware of the original 1856 one. And then, was that another 17 years after that? So it's like I don't do maths for a job, isn't it? Another 17 years after that, and some guys come up with this study where part of it is a king e6 blunder here that transposes directly into the 1938 study. So there's a blunder on move 2 which will take you back to a study 17 years before, which in turn there was another study 82 years before where there was an I4 square or an H4 square. All clear as mud. And at the end of all of that, by the way, all those studies were studying the same sort of themes, the same ideas, and I feel like I've studied it, and I feel like I do understand it better. I still haven't got a set of rules for what you need to do particularly, and I certainly wouldn't memorise, oh yeah, if you get that position you need to bring your bishop to that square. I just wouldn't do that. Just all you need to do is know that Zugzwang's a very important tool, and if you're the defending side, you've got to work like stink, knowing that, trying to stop your opponent achieving it, and if you're the attacker, you've got to try and achieve it. All in time trouble, and of course we'd mess it up completely. Now this position is white to play. Pause the video and have a go at it. It's a draw if you play it well, but there is a defensive resource that it's more trickery, more sneakery with the knights. You always got to look for tactics and sneakery in these positions. I think Jesus de la Villa says that these positions are very difficult to come up with rules, but they are rich in tactics, and this position's no exception. The first move is fairly clear, king to c2, but black's got one hell of a barrier there, and your own knight stopping your king getting out. So your king's sort of imprisoned by everything, really. It's sort of not looking good. And if you just do nothing, you are going to get zugzwanged into a loss. Okay, so the black king's just going to come and put itself on a decent square, e3. White might realise that at this stage and think, oh no, better get in the check, knight e5 check, king e4 rather than king e3. King e3 would lead to the win eventually, be a lot more messing about. But king e4, knight d3, king e3, that's the simplest, and it's just a very easy zugzwang. So king c2, you will do this sort of do nothing plan until black goes a little bit too far away from their own e-pawn. And this is the bit where you've got to jump in with knight e1. Absolutely brilliant move. That knight can't be taken because king d3, and then you pre-move king takes e2. So that knight can't be taken. Absolutely brilliant. Black might think, well, I'm going to come and get it anyway. Now I am threatening to take it. So you've got to defend your knight. And you say, no, I haven't. I'll attack your pawn. King f2, knight to c2. And we've swapped round the king and the knight. And the knight's just untouchable there on c2. So black's just got nothing. There'll always be a square that the white king can use and maintain contact. They don't even need to maintain contact with the e2 pawn. You know, if the king came to f1, for example, I'm pretty sure we could just go off to c4 and then come back to d3 on the next move. So the only way black's going to make any kind of progress is to kind of try and shoulder you away, like with a move like king f3. Okay? But then you can go knight d4 check, king wherever, and then knight back to, well, in fact, knight takes e2, so I've just realised in that position. So they can't play king f3. In fact, what can they do? That's just completely drawn, isn't it? It's easy to see that's a draw. Right, next. Again, defensive resources for white. This position's another little reminder of... I mean, in chess in general, we shouldn't be sort of... what's the word? Just sort of... It's like a bad habit, isn't it? It's like a bad... You always do something automatically, and you need to shake your head and be on the lookout for, like... That's not always the case, and it's especially not the case here, which is the idea that of things like, you know, if your king is stalemated, which it is here, all you need to do is lose your other piece. So, for example, I mean, we want to get the knight across. Black's threatening this, so we want to get a thing. Oh my God, we're going to get the knight across and cover the c1 square. But knight f2 loses because the black bishop can just step in and dominate that knight. Bishop c2. All right, the a pawn falls. King f4, king a3, and the black bishop steps back again. And knight d1 is met with c2. Followed by queening, either on c1 or d1, depending on what white does. So as I said that, I just need to be careful there wasn't a forking check, which there is, but the bishop's covering the d3 square. Oh, and we're queening with check. So yeah, that knight's just dominated. That knight's just got nowhere to go. So king comes in, push the pawn, king b2, king e3, white's dead. What else could we see back in this position? We might see knight h3 check. I mean, the knight's just going a long way away there, isn't it? Bishop f5, knight back to g1. Knight's dominated on g1. That was clearly one, isn't it, that one? So yeah, it's about sort of just reprogramming ourselves to realise, well, hang on, we could play knight g5 here. We can play knight f4. If they're of any use to us. The f4 square's not out of bounds. The king can't take it. The knight can go to f4 as freely as it can go to f2. And we do want it on f4 because it gives us this little choice. It stops black's domination plan. Although in a way, it looks like black's domination plan's even better because they can dominate your knight while simultaneously defending a2. But you had to find this next move, which is a genius defensive resource. You've got to be a little bit more careful here with just plonking your knight anyway. It's true that wherever you plonk your knight, the king can't take it. But it's not true that wherever you plonk your knight, the bishop can't take it. And not that you'd ever want to play either of these two moves, but if you did, the bishop could just take it, because then the a2 pawn is no longer defended. It's no longer a stalemate. But this square's alright. Bishop can't take that. That's stalemate. And this is fantastic. We're attacking the c-pawn. That's being played next move. Unless white moves it. And then we take it anyway. Draw. So knight f4 is a pretty cool first move. And yeah, black definitely doesn't want to try and dominate that knight with bishop c4. So let's say black pushes the c-pawn. Then you've got to choose d3 or e2, although in fact either of them's fine. So knight d3, bishop to c4, knight back to c1, king comes in, king b2. We are now threatening to take the c-pawn. The only way to defend it really is bishop d3, but then we could take on a2. Bishop b3, we just take that with our knight. And we can't get deflected by the pawn because we've got a knight covering both of them, king and knight covering both those squares. So black here would have to try the sort of desperado a1 queen and bring the king in. And it looks like, uh-oh, this isn't so good. What's going on here? Our knight's dominated by the bishop still. You know, clever stuff, but we're going to lose this anyway. You're not going to lose this anyway. It's the stalemate trick. King a1. The knight can't be taken. If the bishop relinquishes control of a2, we play knight a2 and bring it back again. This is why king on b2, by the way. And if black stops us coming to b2 of our king, so it looks like we're completely out of moves. Bosh. How about that for a move? Knight b3. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, the king can't even come back to d2 to... That would work, by the way, wouldn't it? King d2, king b2, bishop takes knight. Oops, you lost, but the king can't come back to d2. So knight b3, absolutely brilliant move. And yeah, this was an actual game from 1996. It went like this, and after all this messing about, knight b3 again, the players agreed to draw there. Right, next. Yeah, this one was hard. I struggled with this one for a long time. Got there eventually, but I wasn't 100% convinced that my final best idea was the solution to the well, it's a game from 1939. I've lost whether the game actually went like this, but this is how the game sort of should have gone. I mean, the first moves, that's pretty clear, isn't it? H5, and I mean, everyone can see that's a draw. That's just sort of nothing to look at. But obviously black doesn't take the pawn. I mean, Dvoretsky had the bishop going to h7, but I thought, well, why can't black play bishop c2 when you push the h-pawn bishop back to h7? I think it all just leads to the same thing. It is in that we'll push the h-pawn up the board, and it doesn't really matter how far we push it. At some point, we're going to have to realise that black's controlling this diagonal. We can't move the knight, so we do have to let the black king come into d4. And the reason it took me so long is because I couldn't find a way to stop that. And I spent so long concentrating, how do we stop the king coming to d4? And eventually you realise you can't. The black king does have to be let into d4. But then you can shove in a check on f3. All right, king c3, knight back to d2. Bishop d3 check wouldn't get very far. King back to d1. But black's more dangerous plan is king c2. It's like, now what do you do? Yeah, because if you play something like king e3 here, you've lost. King d1. Or if you played king e1, bishop d3 is a pretty nasty zugzwang. So what do? Well, you go knight c4. Attacking the b pawn, so it has to be pushed. Not immediately, sorry, black's got this check. So if you're attacking the b pawn, it has to be pushed, and then as soon as it is, I mean, that's just going to be a draw. The problem with knight c4, sorry, I explained that the wrong way around. The problem with knight c4 is that bishop d3 check picks up the knight. Oh, don't put your king on the first rank. It's got to come up to e3, otherwise b1 queen is going to be happening with check in a sec. The bishop has to take the knight first, because obviously knight a3 check was still lurking. h7, b1 equals queen, h8 equals queen, draw. This is why I was a bit nervous, because I sort of eventually found this solution, and I was a bit nervous. It's like, is it right? Is this right? And you look around for are there ways in which black can quickly round up the queen. I mean, this check here looks pretty useful straight away. You don't want to go to a light square, because then the bishop joins the attack and it's probably going to be carnage. You don't want to go to d4 because of the skewer. And in fact, king f4 is... as I say that, so king f4 is the only drawing move. Wow. The engine's found king f3. I said you don't want to go to a light square because it's going to be carnage. But apparently that's not carnage. I wouldn't fancy it. I wouldn't fancy defending queen and bishop versus queen, to be honest. I do know someone who's done it successfully before. In fact, that person is the top seed in a tournament I'm playing in this weekend. Will probably win the tournament I'm playing in this weekend. Right, next. This one's pretty cool. This is a study from 1979. This is well worth spending some time on. Pause the video and have a real good go at it before seeing the solution. I didn't get it, but I spent a long time on it. I sort of roughly got the idea, but I think I got the timing wrong. The first thing to note is that if you just sort of ignore what's going on with the c-pawn and just play g4, for example, the black king comes into c2. It's just hopeless. Knight f2, bishop e3, knight e4, king d3. It's hopeless. That's completely lost. Yeah, that c-pawn's just sort of marching in. And this bishop's brilliantly placed on e3. So that's the first thing to notice. Okay. So the first move's kind of pretty obvious. You can't allow the black king into c2. So it's king b1. By the way, actually, something that's worth pointing out is that after g4, king c2, yeah, this is the key to the entire study. Sorry, I should have covered this. If we play knight b2, bishop g7, we've lost the knight. Okay. But just imagine if we didn't have any g-pawns. Because then king a2, and it's a draw. Bishop takes knight is stalemate. If bishop doesn't take the knight, we're going to take on c4. And if the c-pawn gets pushed, we play knight a4 and take it the next go. So that would be... And by the way, if the knight doesn't get pinned, we would do that. The problem is that we have g-pawns. And when you have g-pawns that can move, you are not stalemated. You're going to get checkmated in 14 moves time. But then that sort of takes you back to like, hang on a minute. So if we could sort of recreate this where we don't let the black king into c2 and we've got that little trick of knight to b2 with the stalemate thing. We just need to get rid of our g-pawns, basically. So yeah, king b1, you've got to stop the black king coming into c2. Bishop g5, black just tries to stop those g-pawns moving. g4. Okay. Bishop d2. By the way, if the c-pawn got pushed at any time, we just take it. And we just start jettisoning our g-pawns. Just get rid of them. Bishop takes g5. There's a sort of zugzwang thing going on here. If we play g3, that loses the game to virtually any bishop move, g4, bishop g5, and we are in zugzwang. Okay, either we have to let the king into c2, with the same problem that it's not stalemate in a minute. This sort of variation. That's not stalemate because we've still got our g-pawn. Or, rather than letting the king into c2, we have to move the knight, but then the c-pawn's coming through. So don't play g3. Instead play g4. Black bishop moves, g5. If the black bishop doesn't take that, then we've got the e3 square to play with. That's attacked the pawn, so it has to move. But then the knight comes back to c2. And yeah, this is going to be a very easy draw. We've even got this g-pawn to keep black busy. But we can always do knight moves somewhere. There's no way the black king and bishop can cover all 6 of those squares at the same time. So we'll just move to whichever one isn't being covered and then pre-move knight c2 back. So that's a very easy draw. So yeah, black has to take the g-pawn. But now all our g-pawns are gone. So we just play king a1. We just leave the knight on d1, and it can't be touched. The black king can't come in via c3, and as soon as it comes in via c2, it's just stepped in front of its own pawn. So we'd see knight b2, pin, king a2, draw. Obviously stalemate if it takes, or winning the pawn if it doesn't. What else could black try here? They could try king a3. We just put our king back on b1. If king b3, we're going around in circles. If bishop f6, we've just been allowed to c2, and now we just need to move the knights anywhere on the board without getting it trapped, basically. So how cool was that? Don't let the king into c2, get rid of your g-pawns, and then let the king into c2 because of, well, let's see it, because of this stalemate. I was 1 year old when someone came up with that study, but still enjoying it 46 years later. Right, this one is from a 1999 game. The person playing white in the game messed it up with their next move. So pause the video and see if you can do better. It's extremely hard to see how. Again, there's no sort of principles you can get out at the end of this. It's just, you know, even after having seen it, I'm trying to work out, you know, how would I know next time not to play king c7? It's such a natural move. I guess the problem is that the black knight can just sort of stay on a5. That was the problem. So king f6, bishop d7, king e5, bishop c6, and the black king just sort of came around the back. And I suppose once you see more of white's moves, it does sort of start to come across as a bit aimless and nonsensical, really. Yeah, maybe that's the problem with king c7, I guess, is that there's just no follow-up. You've got to shift the knight. So king b5 was the move to play. Knight to b7, bishop c8, knight d6, king to c5, and we're going for that zugzwang thing. The black knight needs to stay on d6, but we've now forced it to move because the black king can't stay in its defense. Knight e4 check, king c6. This is looking pretty good. Knight back to d6. Bishop a6 dominates the knight that way. If the knight moves away, obviously b7's going to look pretty good. Although knight f7 is a possibility here, isn't it? I'll come back and look at that in a sec because of the d8 fork if we push the b pawn. I suppose we've got, I'll come back to it in a sec, but yeah, king e6, bishop e2, king e7, bishop b5, king back to e6, bishop a4. A lot of messing around. You had to triangulate because you wanted your bishop on a4 for when black plays king e7, then you play your bishop back to b3, and yeah, black's in trouble. Let's go back. I'm recovering f7 there, but let's go back to the bit where I started to look at, is it there? Yeah, knight f7. Lots of winning moves, but king c7 does seem to be the main one. And I guess if knight d8 would play bishop b5, looks pretty good. Oh, I didn't like bishop b5. Oh, because you're getting checked there. That's annoying. So bishop c4. King e8. Bishop b5 check. King back to e7. Okay, yeah, bishop d7. And if knight d6, it's going to be pretty similar, isn't it? Knight d6. Oh, that's going to be incredibly similar to the game now. Bishop c4 is a nice one. I like that. Your pawn's still 2 squares from promotion. Haven't we transposed to the game there? If I just click on... Wasn't the knight on d6 in the game? Somewhere around... Maybe not. But yeah, bishop c4. Zugzwang straight away. You'd have to have some balls to play that, wouldn't you? I suppose you just got to quickly calculate the knight can't get to a6, which is the check you'd really want to worry about. Next, this is black to move. Black is winning this. Zugzwang's going to be pretty important again. But black has only one winning move. So your main two choices are really king d3 and bishop f4. King d3 is fairly obvious, attacks the knight, defends the pawn. Bishop d4 stops the white king coming into f2. The only other move that doesn't just sort of lose the e-pawn straight away is something like bishop a5. King comes into f2, king d3, then we got knight e1 check. And either the e-pawn's falling or it's a classic king and pawn stalemate. So not bishop a5. So your two choices are really king d3 and bishop d4. One of them's a draw, the other one wins. In the game, the player playing black chose bishop d4, and now it's a draw. Knight went back to e1, king came into e3, knight c2 check, and we saw a sort of perpetual going on. I think we've seen a similar position to this already, and it just became impossible for black to achieve the Zugzwang, and they agreed to draw there. So in the original position, black should have played king d3. White comes into f3. It's that sort of trick again. If king f2, then black can play king d2. If knight e1, bishop d4 check, and that's that one gone. So king f3, king d2, then king f2. So you're covering bishop d4 check, but you're not covering bishop d4 check. How about that? King f3, and then bishop g1. Zugzwang. Really important winning tool, the Zugzwang, but also massively important in all of it was to shake off that feeling of needing to not put your pieces on certain squares. The knight was not covering the d4 square. I even said it, didn't I? Sort of even as I I said, are you going to put your king on f3 because king f2, because then you're covering the bishop d4 check. I was even sort of thinking it myself. Having already said that we should be shaking our feelings of it. It doesn't cover bishop d4 check because it was protecting the e1 square. One final position. It's white to play. Pause the video, have a go at it. It is one with Zugzwang being the theme again. You can see white's got a fairly favourable position. It's just this little fly in the ointment that you need to sort out. So bishop f5, only winning move. Okay. Black pushes the h-pawn. You can't really let the king this way, so your bishop has to stay on that diagonal, guarding that square, but you also have to guard the d7 square. Otherwise, this little hopping around is extremely irritating, or even that one is going to be very hard to deal with. In fact, that's surely going to lead to a draw, similar to what we talked about earlier on, because the king's just going to come and attack the d-pawn as soon as the white king makes its way to attack the b8 knight, and white's also got to deal with this. So it's a king move. King e6, only winning move. And black's just sort of out of moves each time, by the way. h4. King f6, h3, bishop takes h3, and now that's allowed the king this way, king e4. White has only one winning move still, which is king e6. Just bring the king across, king back to f4, bishop f5, Zugzwang. or king d4, bishop f5, zugzwang. And that was actually the way that this 1940 game played out. I don't know how many positions I've covered there. That was 13, I think. So 13 different positions. Bishop and pawn versus knight. Hopefully loads of similar useful ideas, enough to give us something in our games if we get bishop and pawn versus knight. But sadly, no definite rules. Sorry about that.